Hi, this is David Bennett, Curator of Maritime History with the North Carolina Maritime Museum System. Today we'll be discussing the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the Great Depression. This is part of a multi-part series, and we're beginning with Part 1, the Great Depression and North Carolina's commercial fishing industry. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, resulting in nationwide economic depression that lasted well into the late 1930s. The United States suffered from record unemployment, nationwide poverty, homelessness, and then there was the New Deal, government programs designed to get Americans back on their feet, programs like the Works Progress Administration. But what about Eastern North Carolina and its fishing communities? What about the commercial fishing industry and the people that worked in it? What was going on there? And that's really what we're going to be focusing on. So Eastern North Carolina was facing not only a depressed economy, but also a depressed fishing industry. One of the reasons for this was overfishing that had been going on prior to the Depression, but also leading into the Depression. Um, Too many fishermen were catching too many fish, particularly too many small, immature fish that weren't able to grow to be larger, more marketable sizes, which resulted in a devaluation. Amongst these fish was the American and Hickory shad, two species that were rather valuable on to northern markets and were very important to the fisheries of Dare County and the counties around the Albemarle Sound. Um, these counties really relied on these fish; they're cornerstones of their commercial fishing industries. And without them, or with the decreased number, these counties suffered. Then oysters, another extremely valuable fishery, had been in decline since the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and their loss was keenly felt during the 20s and 30s. There's actually Works Progress Administration projects getting North Carolina fishermen and their families to plant oyster shells in order to try and rehabilitate some of the oyster reefs. In the late 20s, seagrass and scallops mysteriously disappeared. Seagrass is a natural habitat for scallops, and scallops were extremely valuable. And Carteret County was pretty much the only county that was producing scallops commercially in North Carolina. They're producing such valuable and um, such numerous scallops that it had an effect on the New York markets. Then there's overwhelming competition from the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay had usually dominated when it came to the crab and the oyster industries, but because of overfishing in North Carolina, the Chesapeake Bay began to gain a competitive edge on other fisheries, such as croaker and weakfish, during seasons when they normally wouldn't have had a competitive edge. Then there are northern trawlers that were glutting the northern markets and depressing the value of fish. And some of these trawlers are even coming into North Carolina waters and fishing in competition to North Carolina fishermen. So you had a glutted fish market, which was driving down prices of fish, plus you had an economic depression that was just further um, driving down the demand because people just didn't have enough money to spend on these more expensive seafood dishes. And so ultimately, a lot of fish was wasted. Tens of thousands of pounds were regularly dumped offshore by North Carolina fishermen because the markets just couldn't absorb their catch. And so here's a graph of the opening years of the Great Depression showing the value of fish landed in North Carolina from 1928 to 1923 and the downward trend in value of seafood. So the decreased value of fish was a challenge for the North Carolina economy, but there was also an increased cost of commodities. So things like fuel for boats, fishing gear, um, all the things that would be needed to make the commercial fishing industry function were becoming more and more expensive, while the fishermen were getting less and less for their fish. And because of this, this placed North Carolina's commercial fishing industry on the verge of financial ruin. So, further exacerbating these problems was a lack of law enforcement regarding the fishery laws in North Carolina. The enforcement capabilities existed, however, they were dependent on tax revenue derived from the commercial fishing industry, and with less revenue coming in through the industry, there's less tax money. And with less tax money, that means the fewer people to go out and enforce the law. So there are unchecked violations like nets in restricted areas where fish would spawn, or fishing at night or on Sundays, which had been illegal in North Carolina for generations, or people poaching their neighbors' nets, forcing people to actually stay out in their boats for extended periods of time just to protect their nets. And then there's also the encroachment of out of state trawlers. You take all this chaos and economic depression and you throw the hurricane of September 1933 on top of it. It was a devastating Category 3 hurricane which struck Carteret County at night, and there was just a corridor of destruction from Beaufort to the Virginia Capes, resulting in over $150,000 in damage to the commercial fishing industry. In 2020 dollars, that would be in excess of $3 million. So, amidst this chaos and economic depression, the fishermen and their families were really struggling. From 1933 to 1935, a fisherman made on average $168 a year, which is approximately $3,400 in 2020 money. And they had to use this to buy or repair fishing gear, buy or maintain boats, buy fuel, and also support a family. And they just couldn't do that on such little money. Then there's just the everyday challenges of being a fisherman. You have to deal with weather and tide and wind, uh, getting your catch from point A to point B to the markets, uh, working with middlemen, um, market prices, all these things that fishermen would usually have to deal with. And because of all this, you had 65% of North Carolina fishermen were involved in some sort of welfare program. Um, and this was really tough because the fishing communities of eastern North Carolina were very, self-reliant. That they didn't really want handouts, but they were forced to take them. And then, so not only were the fishermen struggling, but so were the wholesale fish dealers who had traditionally helped support the fishermen. Traditionally, fishermen could go to the dealers and for credit, so they could buy or maintain fishing gear or purchase fuel, and then they would repay the dealers through their catch. Um, Unfortunately, the dealers weren't getting a whole lot of money for fish, but they had to finance the fishermen so they could actually go out and catch the fish. But unfortunately, the fishermen weren't making enough money off their catch to pay the dealers back. So in 1932, the wholesale fish dealers in eastern North Carolina tried to organize the fishermen and the dealers into one unit with the idea of promoting the industry and getting better legislation um, to set sanitary standards for transportation and marketing of seafood in attempts to get more money out of seafood, um, set better prices, have quality control standards. And they also were seeking assistance from different government agencies. Unfortunately, this didn't work out, and this grassroots movement fizzled out. In many of these fishing communities, they banded together and they pled for government support because they're having a real difficulty providing for their families and maintaining their businesses. And the government in Eastern or in North Carolina viewed the commercial fishing industry as being an essential part of the economy in Eastern North Carolina, so much so that if fishing was good, then everyone else, it was believed, would prosper. However, if the fishermen weren't doing well, then the rest of the economy in Eastern North Carolina was believed to suffer as well. And so the North Carolina government tried to intervene in by going to the National Recovery Administration to have codes for fair business practices set. So setting prices, reducing competition, to try and stabilize the commercial fishing industry and the market prices. However, this didn't work out because the National Recovery Administration was ruled unconstitutional. Uh, there's also a movement to try and set grades and standards for North Carolina seafood. The Division of Commercial Fisheries would have had to have spearheaded and led this program and implemented this program. However, due to the reduced tax revenue, they could not afford to do so. So everything came to the head, and it pretty much the government officials in North Carolina came to the conclusion that the only salvation for the commercial fishing industry was a fisherman's cooperative. And so that's where we're going to leave off today. And next time, we're going to do part two, the cooperative self help movement and the origins of the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, which was a fisherman's cooperative during the Great Depression. And the photos that you've seen here, they've come from the Library of Congress, National Archives, North Carolina Maritime Museum, or the State Archive, or the State Archives of North Carolina. And here's my sources. All right, thank you very much. See you next time.